Hello and welcome to Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. The forces of the far right are gaining ground almost everywhere. If fascism offers false solutions to real problems, then clearly we need our own compelling counter-narratives and infrastructures of resistance. And, quite simply, we need more of us. But what draws people into political movements? And what sustains us in the face of defeat, heartbreak, infiltration and state repression? Is it all just for an idea? To think through some of these questions, I'm joined on the show today by Laura Forster and Joel White, co-authors of the new book, Friends in Common, Radical Friendship and Everyday Solidarities. Laura and Joel argue that friendship is an undertheorised but vital piece of the puzzle and full of revolutionary potential. Friendship can transcend social boundaries and political borders. As a radical practice, it's capable of upending hierarchy and producing social change. In an often alienating world, friendship offers us an antidote to capitalist despair. In our conversation today, we talk about family abolition and comradeship. We discuss the Kurdish idea of Hevalti, friendship as a form of social reproduction, and the ways in which the state simultaneously dismisses friendship and reads it as a threat. We talk about friendship in relation to solidarity, and ask whether far-right movements are also sustained by friendship. The book, Friends in Common, is available now from Pluto Press. Podcast viewers can get 40% off the book through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. Okay, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is Laura Forster and Joel White on Radicals in Conversation. So Laura, Joel, thank you both for taking the time to come on the show and talk to me today about your new book, Friends in Common, Radical Friendship and Everyday Solidarities. I just finished reading it yesterday, always down to the wire with this. And it's a really excellent book. So there's a lot that we're going to be able to talk about today. I guess I'll summarize some of your key arguments just at the top so people kind of have a sense of what we might get into. But this is a book about friendship, how the interpersonal is political. Friendship is, conditioned by power and hierarchy, but there's still this radical potential, in reconfiguring our bonds of intimacy, as you put it. That capitalism co-opts and sort of conditions our friendship, but it's never totalizing. It's never sort of completely, that this sort of friendship as a specific mode of, I guess, radical political belonging. We really see it emerge in a couple of particular sort of historical junctures. You talk about the sort of late 19th century and then the period that's sort of post sort of 1970, let's say, that we really see friendship as this kind of, specific mode of political organizing and belonging in these times. And then it can serve as a sort of like bridging concept between scales and binaries, I guess. So things like personal, political, private, public, local, global, that kind of thing. So maybe we'll touch on some of these kind of headline areas in the course of this conversation. But let's start with the obvious stuff, because this is a book about friends and you're there in the same space. You're clearly friends, colleagues, etc. So can you say a little bit more about yourselves? How did you first meet? And I guess what was the genesis of this project in particular?
Well, thanks for having us first, Chris.
Yeah, thanks
Appreciate
so much.
it. Yeah, it's dead nice to be on. We met through a friend in common. We've both been writing bits about friendship in quite different ways. Me coming at it kind of historically, Joel thinking about it through more kind of organising, and particularly quite a lot of migrant solidarity stuff right at that time. And had been writing his PhD in a kind of anthropological, is that fair to say? Vein about forms of friendship. And I'd been writing about forms of friendship, as I say, a bit more historically and also more sort of, in slightly different ways. Anyway, so we got in touch via a friend in common and then just kind of started chatting about it. I guess we didn't know at first what we wanted to do with it. We just enjoyed, it was a really nice way to talk across different disciplines and from different experiences. And but yeah, then we just found that we were becoming mates that easily. So we had like a lovely rapport, and I feel like it was just, I just really loved chatting to Joel about it. And as time went on, we were like, maybe we should try and put something together. And so it came about pretty organically, like really, as I say, I think what was really, and it's reflected in the book, I think, as you've said, covers quite a lot, but I think that was what was really nice about the process, was kind of dipping into lots of different types of literatures, chatting to lots of different types of people. What else would you add about
Genesis
totally. About beautiful friendship?
Just that we've been joking through the tour that, like, it's a good example of how you can become friends through organising and working and thinking together. And so now there's a lot of pressure on us to remain as tight as possible, which I'm really excited about. So we're already like, what do we write next? We got
Let's write about betrayal.
Yeah.
Joel's right. It's true. Where we talk about in the book a bit about kind of errand friendships as like this kind of way of thinking of friendship as part of the rhythms of your everyday life, and how that can be kind of really a beautiful way to do friendship and to think about politics as well. I think this became our sort of errand, like, writing this book and, trying to sort of create a sense of political belonging and, intimacy between the two of us, but also thinking about how that manifests sort of in the world and more broadly. So.
Yeah, I love the whole bit about the errand friend in duality or dichotomy with like the brunch friend, and maybe we'll get onto that a little bit later. I guess I'll say, like, one of the first books that I'd read already when I started reading this book that came to mind was Maurice Casey's Hotel Lux, An Intimate History of Communism's Forgotten Radicals, which I think in some ways has like a lot of the same themes as this book, even though it's quite a different book. It's about friendships forged in political activity, political commitments that have been sustained through friendships, what it means to have friendship across difference. And that becomes, I guess, particularly acute during, the Stalinist terror of the 30s. The book deals with questions of family, comradeship, finding affinity with people who are long dead through the archive, and etc. So there's a big plug for that book. We didn't publish it, but it's a great book. Just thinking about, again, you mentioned there's quite a lot of different... You come at the idea of friendship or the concept of friendship from a few different angles in this book. But there is something for everyone there, because we all have experiences of friendship, whether that's, finding, solace or joy or whatever through our friendship, or difficulty making connection. There's something there that is going to draw people into this book, I think. So, thinking about my own introduction to like activism, when I was 18 or whatever, it was making a new friend in halls, my first term at university, who was also politically minded. We sort of chimed on that level, but he was more outgoing than me. So like he dragged me along into different activist spaces, and that really propelled me, from there. And then it was like, I think it was a Gaza Solidarity sit-in in 2009 that then solidified a lot of those sort of acquaintances, that I'd made in those scenes into friendships. And then that affinity group from university turned into a house share in London. And again, that was a big sort of propellant for my political activity, because it was social activity, crucially. I wanted to spend time with my friends, and the things that we did were political. So, and it's interesting actually that then my kind of political activism activity outside of my paid work at Pluto, which is obviously deeply political, but in different ways, it sort of declined after that shared house sort of dispersed, and we all went our separate ways geographically a bit more. So, from that kind of, I guess, narrow autobiographical perspective, I found the whole kind of position that you put forward in the book, that, friendship needs to be afforded a bigger role in our analysis of what drives political action, really quite compelling. So, yeah, I'd be curious to know a bit more about your own roots into like left politics. Did you have a similar experience? Was friendship a key factor there, or was it really more about, finding friends in books and in the archive? Or so
I think, like you said at the beginning, we do really think that there's something, and I think people are almost a bit embarrassed about it, right? Because there's a sense that actually that's not how politics should happen. We should be kind of very carefully thinking through our positions and our stances, and then joining particular tendencies and parties in a deliberative way, because of the ideas, and they're driving everything. And then that's how politics should happen. And if you just end up going to a protest because your mate's going, that's not really as valid as something, which I think, I don't know, I can see why people feel bad about it. I've certainly wondered about that, and people have asked us about that with the book. But I guess, like you said at the beginning, our contention is in many ways that since the decline of formal party membership and comradeship as a kind of distinct category in the left, like that is how a lot of people in our generation and the generation one or two before have come into politics. And I think there's a kind of, rather than just dismissing that as kind of a slightly naive or unimportant fact, we need to consider it as a kind of social and historical fact that deserves kind of our attention and kind of consideration, and that it has driven some really incredible and quite like world-changing movements, particularly the kind of like anti-globalization kind of noughties movement, which is, I guess, was at the tail end when I was first getting involved. To answer your question, I think I grew up in Bradford. I've been working a lot recently on this project about this place called the Bradford Resource Centre, doing some archival and film work there. And I think places like that are very key to the kind of political milieu in Bradford. It was a place that I went as a kid, and there was trade union offices, there was anti-racist groups organising there was LGBTQ plus groups. It was it was a real kind of melting pot of different tendencies and people. And I think, I did make friends, but also friends across different generations, which we talk about in the book quite a lot. We'll get onto. And I think that was very formative for me, particularly growing up around some I joke in the book that my neighbour gave me a copy of selected works of Marx and Engels for 14th birthday. I know that's not maybe what happens to a lot of people, but the point isn't that then Marx and Engels necessarily completely propelled me in a direction, but actually the gift of that was always then imbued with the relationship of that person to me, who was this very important old family friend. Yeah. So there's people like that I think were very formative, and I think it's nice and important, and we've been doing these workshops around kind of what we call anti-family trees, or just thinking about different ways that, say, particularly in the lives of queer people, often we've tried and had to create different lineages and different ideas of who kind of inspired and influenced us, and that can include elements of what we might think of as family, but it also includes lots of people who aren't in that category. So I think there's lots of that in Bradford. I guess I also just had, similarly to you, I think a lot of really formative friendships in my kind of teens, and particularly around this place, the 1 in 12 Club in Bradford, which is an anarchist social centre, still very much running strong, and then at uni as well. So I think a lot of those, not just physically attending and being at things, but then also discussing and working on what we meant by doing that together. And I think that's, the kind of affinity group model and some of these ways of organising kind of necessarily challenges to consider the actual ways in which we are kind of building our interpersonal lives in a way that can support the struggle or something. And that's the hope. But I don't know about you, though.
No, absolutely. I mean, similarly, I grew up in Stockport, but also just that kind of intergenerational and kind of these sort of forms of friendship and kind of affinities that maybe you don't even realize when you're younger are kind of inculcating you with this sense of both a sense of belonging and also a sense of, different kind of ideas and doctrines, even if they're not kind of approached through, the seminal texts or whatever. But that kind of course, similarly, as I'm sure, which we say in the book, a lot of people have experienced, as you've said, leaving home and finding friendships through kind of vague kind of political leanings, and then through that sort of discovering lots of different types of more formal politics, and also all sorts of other types of forms of kind of politicized belonging. And I, really liked history from a young age, and always I thought this, whenever I was reading history, I was always like, but how did they get into that or do that? I always was fascinated about reading about sort of, revolutionary moments and these kind of big characters that, have changed things, and these sort of liberation struggles that obviously when you're reading them you feel like, wow, that's so amazing, and it feels almost detached from the kind of day-to-day how this might happen. And always I was thinking how do these people come at these things, and then I always think to myself, if I was long dead and somebody was looking at my archival trace, they'd be like, well, maybe at one point she was a member of the Labour Party, maybe at one point she joined such a group, but really it would be in terms of institutions, it might look a bit like, oh, right. And that would give only the tiniest picture of what I would think of as my political life. So I always think that when I'm approaching people in the past, I'm like, okay, I can see a few of these, formal affiliations or whatever it may be, but and maybe they've published this or they wrote this one particular tract. But that is a tiny, tiny snippet. So how do we get at the other stuff? And I think friendship then for me became an important way of thinking about approaching histories as well.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting thinking about traditional historical archives. There's a more expansive idea of the archive, which we might talk about in a bit. But I think you point out quite rightly in the book that if you're a member of a sort of trade union or maybe a more traditional sort of Marxist-Leninist party type structure, you might leave more of an archival trail, organizationally speaking. If you're maybe coming from a sort of more anarcho-socialist perspective, there might be a bit less of that, partly because the activity might be a bit more clandestine in nature, or because it's more of those informal networks. So you might leave a bit less of a footprint. I mean, I guess also letter writing was a big thing. Correspondence was a big thing historically, and is less so now, or at least it's changed. And, it's probably more sort of online, even email is probably no longer really much of a thing. So it does make you wonder, like, for the historian in the future, like how they will have to engage with what materials they have and what kind of a picture they can piece together. But that's sort of by the by, I guess.
Letter writing quite a lot in the book, actually. I think that's maybe we can come back to this important part. We argue of like how forms of friendship can unfold, and it really gives a sense of that sort of deliberative and relational kind of nature of friendship. And as you say, it's been very important historically, and I think still today, although as you say, it manifests differently. But when we tried to think about zines and other ways that people have attempted to sort of slow down forms of engagement, but still create this sort of a kind of lineage and a kind of engagement with each other and with the past and with people elsewhere, that I think is a similar sort of way of thinking about the relational. Friendship can never exist alone in one person. It's always made in relation, and often through letters and kinds of correspondence.
And this stuff we're doing in Bradford, exactly what you're saying, because this archival project, I'm not an archivist, we're just trying to do this kind of, we talk about in the book, like history from within, where you're like part of a struggle, you went to this place, the resource centre, you were involved, and you just try and do history yourself, inspired by history from below, but kind of actually you were there and you're kind of doing it as you do it. And there's plenty of historians who do really interesting work on the digital and on kind of post-millennial history, I'm sure, but then in this case, basically, I found like 2 amazing boxes of stuff, say, on the history of the network of trade union and labour research resource centres, right? And from 81, like an incredible archive just sitting in a basement. We found some wild stuff down there, like stuff on the Bradford 12 and the Asian youth movement, on all these very early lesbian and gay groups. Get to 2000 and it's just not there. Like, and the people I'm talking to are still, most of them are still alive, right? They're just like, I don't know, the website went down, the email's lost, the hard drive's gone corrupt. Like, there's just nothing. And so the history there just is very, very hard to trace. And so it's been really interesting seeing that in a very particular way, having tried to kind of write about that a bit first. And the stuff we do find is, these kind of written correspondence that people still did. Because obviously there's still a lot going on.
There's the letter that you kind of start the book with from Jean Genet, which maybe we've kind of already put to bed. But this idea that there is often too much emphasis put on the roles of ideas, on theory, principle, and ideology as the web that holds movements together and explains them, and that actually that's missing something. In terms of like why people dedicate themselves to political movements time and time again, why they endure so much disappointment, grief, turbulence, betrayal, as well as the highs that come from it. And I think this is something that you, I guess, carry throughout your book, and you return to this letter and you engage with it. So maybe there's something more to say there. I don't know, but I guess also then we should probably talk a little bit about this kind of friendship is a very slippery sort of idea, right? It's multifaceted. It's always contextual. It can be quite ephemeral. Sort of eludes definition, but there is still a very kind of hegemonic idea or like cultural script around friendship that we have in society that's probably shaped by capitalist society. So could you say a little bit more about that, and maybe then some of the ways that you're thinking through friendship, or like, I don't want you to define it because it kind of eludes definition, but like some of the ways that you're approaching this idea of friendship in the book?
I think to connect the 2 parts of your question, for us, I feel like we're saying we don't want to be prescriptive. This is not, there's plenty of books out there right now about how to make friends and how to build, like they call it, things like friendtimacy, or like get over being a friendaholic. And it's easy to be dismissive, and I'm sorry if I sound that way. I guess I am a bit dismissive of these very kind of prescriptive things about that basically turn it into kind of a self-care, self-help type problem where you just need to kind of change something intrinsic in you to like build intimacy. But the fact is these books are coming from a real desire and a lack of connection that's out there, and we know that there's like a massive kind of epidemic. They call it loneliness epidemic is the phrase that gets used. I guess we're a bit cautious about that phrasing, but there's a lot of people who are really feeling a lack of connection, a lack of intimacy in their lives. So there's a hunger for that, and these books prescribe a certain way, and we're very cautious of telling people there's one way to do friendship. I guess the kind of friendship we're interested in is the one that Genet, I think, very beautifully and eloquently gestures towards with this phrase around the densest bonds. That's the bit of the letter that I think we come back to the most, probably, is this idea of what does it mean to build these kind of dense bonds, which I guess, like, yeah, when we've been going back and forth with this letter for a long time, and maybe, I don't know, do you want to say what dense bonds means to you on that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting is that the more we use it, I think the way Genet talks about that idea of kind of the sort of rhythms of friendships, the way in which there's a real kind of try for, all the things we might think of as qualities of friendship, directness of feeling, honesty, etc. But also the way he talks about that there's a sense of being kind of enmeshed and held with other people that isn't just subject to, like, I need a friend to do X, Y, Z, or I want to see my friend to feel better about X, Y, Z. Or, things we do all the time that, that's valid, of course, and capitalism really sort of dictates that friendship is this kind of bit on the side that can kind of make us feel a bit better, sometimes, and help us to be more productive in various ways or whatever. But the way Genet describes it is this sense of that, sociality in our social worlds are so fundamental to us that any idea that friendship is a certain thing, or that certain people are better at friendships or more deserving of friendship, kind of becomes impossible in his definition. It's more about sociality is for all of us, if only we make it in that way, and that it's so embedded in our humanness that we have to really take it seriously. And we think about that a lot in the book by thinking about how friendship is made to seem like, as Joel said, this sort of literature around kind of, if you do this better, or if you find these connections, and also they really privilege a certain type of sociality, a certain type of, personality maybe. And what we're suggesting is, that's just one script of friendship, and actually we can reject that script and think about it differently. And that kind of gets us into the family abolition literature, which we talk quite a bit about in one of the chapters, which maybe we'll come back to, but I guess just briefly to say that where the idea that we need to reject all our scripts around family, and about the way in which the nuclear family is there to bolster and uphold a capitalist structure, etc., that there often friendship is absent, or it's suggested that in some ways friendship is just sort of folded into that process of it's nice when you're young, then you've got to do your nuclear family, so there's no time for friendship, and that's kind of gone. And what we're suggesting is that both friendship scripts and family scripts, we can reject what we have and rethink all the kind of forms of relational connection and interpersonal belonging that might cut across biological family or other forms of relationships. Fine, we're not saying we have to throw everything out, but that we can remake those forms of kind of relational connection. To think of friendship more in sort of, as Jean Genet says, as a kind of something that underpins all of our connections with how we are in the world and how we might hope to change it.
I think it's also the sense that he calls it like the glue that holds us together against the onslaught of things that are trying to kind of tear us apart and create these individuated, alienated, capitalist subjectivities, right? And I think that this idea that we need to really consider how to do that. I mean, we kind of cite people like Hannah Proctor's beautiful book on burnout in there, because I think a lot of people are really struggling with that in the moment. Like, against everything we're up against, how do we hold each other? How do we make sure that we're kind of looking after each other without reverting to a kind of, again, very individualized self-help, self-care literature that seems adjacent to the stuff we're talking about, kind of prescribing friendship. And I think, I guess the other person we quote at the start of the book is my friend Yvonne Blake, who runs this amazing group in Glasgow called Migrants Organising for Rights and Empowerment. And I think it's kind of in the conversation that we start between her and Jean Genet. She's organising on kind of these anti-racist, no borders principles, and talks a lot about what it was like to build friendships again across all kinds of difference, but within a struggle against, say, immigration detention. And I think in those kind of examples, rather than prescribing a set of kind of, rules, we can see how it's very important and it's very possible to try and kind of build friendships that do enhance the political struggles that we need, but also kind of name and illuminate how people are excluded from them and how people are generally excluded from capitalist sociality as we know it. Kind of at its peak, the kind of brunch friend that you mentioned earlier, quoting Anahit Behrouz's beautiful book, BFFs. Yeah, I think there's a kind of thing there around these particular elite forms of sociality that are exclusionary financially and spatially in all kinds of ways. And to think, okay, it's probably quite a hard question to ask ourselves, but they're attractive to a lot of people, I think, and a lot of us kind of enjoy certain things. We're not saying people shouldn't have brunch or go out for nice natural wines or whatever, but if that becomes the only way in which we're socializing, I think we do cut ourselves off from the possibility of these denser kind of bonds and the questions that, you know, when you meet on a picket line or in a black bloc or at a meeting, that you kind of have to intrinsically think, okay, well, who's in the room? Who's part of the struggle? How do we bring more people in? How do we make it feel like it can actually meet the problem we're up against? It's that kind of mutual aid principle, I think, really, ultimately, of like, you name the reason the need's not being met as well as the actual kind of trying to meet it.
Right? Yeah.
Sorry.
And there's something about the kind of, in that, friendship as a sort of way of life or a political orientation, not just around individual friendships, but they're super important, and we obviously talk about that quite a lot, but thinking about it as a kind of orientation, and thinking about in this kind of idea of dense friendships that might be short-lived, long-lasting. There's not a kind of set of rules of exactly what it looks like, but that kind of sense of feeling a form of kind of affinity, and often a very much a kind of, as Joel says, part of a kind of something that helps both to counter a political regime and a structural system which seeks to alienate us, but also that in that moment also buoys us, can even through the difficulties, can give us that sense of meaning and connection. And as we say in the book, we think about that historically and how that happens in different spaces that aren't just necessarily explicitly political spaces, or might be sort of these kind of more ways that you create friendships without sort of knowing everyone's sort of family life story or family history or their kind of what they do for their job, but that you can meet people and connect with people in forms of sociality that don't necessarily prescribe to a sort of like, well, we'll sit down and we'll catch up about our kids and that's how we'll do friendship or whatever it may be.
Yeah, there's so much there in that last 5 minutes that I had like a few different places I wanted to go. I mean, it's quite interesting, like, because you also bring in various other voices in the book through conversations. So Gargi Bhattacharya is in there, Luke Dinarone is in there, Gracie May Bradley's in there, all of whom have been on this podcast in various sort of times and talking about different books. And, I guess like in talking about work and like how capitalism sort of contains and trammels the kinds of friendship we're not permitted to have, but that we kind of find ourselves having, I guess, as exemplified by the idea of the brunch friend. It's still true that, Luke, I think maybe in the conversation with Luke, says, well, actually like a lot of, and indeed yourselves, it's still true that you can have meaningful friendships that emerge out of work relationships. And I guess brunch is kind of like, that's sort of defined by, the gap in your schedule between like work and stuff. So there's possibly more generous reading of the brunch friend there. And again, like in terms of like talking about capitalist sort of commodification, you pose the question to Gargi about, does it matter if, friendships are sort of commodified to some degree or like require some sort of commodified avenues? Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's, going out to brunch or, hiring a sports hall to play some badminton or whatever it might be. And I think they say kind of, no, it doesn't really matter necessarily. I mean, maybe it would be good to talk a little bit more about like family abolition and things like the comrade and stuff, because this kind of section of the book I thought was really interesting. How listeners will be familiar with social reproduction, right? That's something we've talked about on this show a lot. It's kind of out there in the literature, how the family unit plays this key role in sustaining capitalism. So it's interesting to think about the ways that friendship sort of sits in this kind of duality with family, how it's sort of sometimes seen as the inverse of family, but it can also it also has a sort of social reproduction role in bolstering the family unit. So there's that kind of...
I mean, Gargi's work on this is amazing, right? So people, if they're not familiar with Gargi's work on social reproduction, I'd say it's an amazing place to start. But yeah, I think that answer they gave where they're talking about the kind of, this idea in a very succinct way, actually, that you just described really well. But there's this debate within the social reproduction literature, I think, and within Marxist feminism and Marxism more generally, about the kind of degree to which the reproductive qualities are totalizing in the system we live under. And I think like someone like, I'd say, Emma Dowling, who we quote, whose work is great, kind of is, I think, more towards where we're at with that, which is that there's kind of, once there is this very much like reproductive and not totalizing, but very reproductive way in which the familial unit as the kind of central node and cell, if you want, of capitalism creates the workers and the pliant like capacities for production. But that also within that there is these gaps and these spaces where people kind of, and Gagi puts this really beautifully in the book they wrote as well, about, you know, the kind of, there's like edges where people just manage to survive and to reproduce and to do things for love and care and connection, and it's not necessarily feeding the system. And I guess that appeals to us, this idea, and I think it's also a good piece of analysis. We also quote some of the family abolitionist writers, people like Amy O'Brien, who is incredible and really has, I think, inspired the book in lots and lots of ways. But I think she's much more on the kind of side of it. No, actually, there are very little ways in which our social lives are not folded into the reproduction of this economic system. So I think it's useful to kind of think about that spectrum and how our analysis then around that kind of fits friendship in. And I'd say in general, social reproduction theory and family abolition writing doesn't discuss friendship much. It's very interested in family for lots of obvious reasons, and I think we were thinking basically this is a useful intervention or something to try and start some conversations that actually help us think about those theories in different ways, just illuminate different aspects, but also think about the real ways in which, like you said, contemporary friendship is very much like often feeding, not just kind of feeding the family in a sense, like kind of giving you a space to let off steam from familial issues, giving you a space to reflect upon different family structures.
And like having friends until you have your own family kind of thing, like keep you busy for a bit.
On a stage, but just also has its kind of, obviously has its own like elite leisure industry around it that exploits, millions of workers in very difficult ways. And there's a kind of whole economic analysis that we build of that. And I think it's useful to bring that in. And I think, I guess the counterpoint to that, and where we come towards this idea that there's actually space to maneuver and, in Gagi's words, play around at the kind of edges, is that like friendship is also where we can practice different forms of sociality and sort of see those edges, see how maybe we're feeding or a part of or folded into this system that can feel very difficult to even grasp, and think, okay, well, what would we do differently? How might our socialities be arranged differently? How is sociality in general kind of distributed across the world we live in? Who is afforded social and leisure time and who isn't? And, in terms of, say, Luke's work, that's very stark into the policing of young black men who are seen as part of gangs is explicitly like a criminalization of friendship. And when we look at something like joint enterprise laws, which has been some really good campaigning work around, this is the racialized, racist policing of friendship, and it's policed in space and it's policed online. So I think there's very clear ways in which we can see how that cuts through, but I think it also just, like, in a broader sense, is in all our lives, and we need to think carefully about it, especially when we're benefiting from a system that doesn't treat us like that. We need to think about that too. But,
Totally. No, I fully agree. I think Joel's right. You said at the beginning that in the book we try and think a bit about friendship as a sort of bridging concept sometimes, and I think it's important here because, as Joel said, it's partly that we're sort of pushing back a little bit on some of the family abolition stuff, which suggests that capitalism is so totalizing that there's no possible way for us to socially reproduce or to kind of connect beyond that. And I guess we're both sort of, I suppose fundamentally probably, we can be a bit romantic about friendship. I think we both see friendship as this sort of, it does allow for those spaces. And as Luke says when I was interviewing him, friendship it makes life worth living. It's available to a lot of us. We can understand it. I think in some ways it's something about thinking through friendship helps us to meet people where they're at. It's something that, we can get onto Comrade in a minute, but maybe that feels like it has more baggage in different ways. So we like that, in the book we kind of try and show how friendship can be a great way in almost, and a way of thinking through what might it look like to remake our more intimate lives and remake our interpersonal connections. Of course, though, also not just that friendship is a sort of leftover or like the side bits of family abolition, but of course, as Joel says, friendship has its own, in its own way, socially reproduces, capitalist culture. And obviously there's a long history, which we don't get into loads in the book because it's a huge amount of literature on sort of philosophic elite friendships, thinking through forms of cronyism, nepotism, all these ways in which friendships in elite political structures, if we think about Sarah Horowitz and lots of other people who write about, the sort of 18th, 19th century worlds and thinking about how politics really works through friendship in these very kind of that totally socially reproduce the structures and the political systems that exist. So of course there's that whole history as well, but again, that's why we find friendship so tantalizing, because it can both totally bolster those means, and it's absolutely a way in which power is funneled, between people and within kind of elite ways, but it's also very much available to us as a tool of trying to resist that and to make life livable, which surely has to be also such an important part of any political project we're involved in, is to try and make life more livable.
I mean, very quickly, I'd say also, coming from an anthropological background, I think it is useful, and this links to Gagi as well, who's written a lot on, say, the way the word anti is used in South Asian communities. I think we're more open than some of the family abolitions, which, to be clear, were very much inspired by and drawing a lot in that first chapter. But I think we're more open to the ways that kinship and ideas of kinship are also quite pliable. And we think carefully about how friendship and family are often seen in opposition and built in opposition culturally, and that actually often it's not as clear cut as that, right? And there's loads of ways that people kind of remake biological family in different ways and remake our ideas of biology and family and also friendship, and that's important. I think we're quite open to possibilities for that. And in Emmy O'Brien's work and in Sophie Lewis's work, they're very much kind of looking towards this revolutionary horizon and this kind of unknown possibility of sociality after that, and that's very inspiring. But I guess we're trying to also then think, okay, well, what kind of things can help us move towards then? I don't think friendship is the only solution at all, but we think
it's not unproblematic. Yeah, totally, of course.
But it's like maybe a way that we can start to kind of think prefiguratively and just in our day to day towards this horizon, which we agree we want to get to. But yeah, I think in doing the history in that section, we sort of do. I'd say in terms of the first question we've got a lot of these talks is like, well, what about comradeship? Comradeship is the important form of political belonging we need. We just need to rebuild some kind of formal structure of comradeship. And I don't think either of us are necessarily against that project. We're maybe saying that actually if we can think more kind of generatively and carefully about how the comrade isn't necessarily how people describe it historically. It's not this kind of grey, completely emotionless autonomation thing. It's like the people who did comradeship historically also did it in a way that had all kinds of affect and emotion and falling outs and getting togethers, and I think lots of people have written beautifully about that. I'd say also that the history that we chart, where you see the kind of emergence of in the sort of era that Laura writes on, things around like fellowship, fraternity, brotherhood and sisterhood, again mixing these familial and non-familial categories of belonging, they're all incredibly important to what then becomes comradeship as this like very key moment of like a shared worker identity, which ironically in some ways I think doesn't necessarily come from workers themselves. Actually, we kind of got this idea that the comrade emerges naturally from like the industrial like sectors and stuff, but actually I think in many ways it was a project that was instilled by people who were looking for a word essentially that didn't that citizen didn't quite work, and like they were okay, and it was very compelling. And
Kirsten Harris has written a book about how a lot of that came from more middle class socialists in the 1880s and 90s reading Walt Whitman and being really attached to this idea of comradely love and finding in that something which helped them, as you say, Joel, to cut across these different categories. And I think the way in which you think about comrade now, obviously it was changed entirely after 1917. It became very much associated with the party form. That's for better or worse. And I think what we found in our work is obviously a lot of what we're talking about with friendship also cuts across comradeship and vice versa. And that's cool and that's great. And actually that's part of what we're saying, that these things are, but the term comrade, perhaps part of its history is precisely that, is to say that it was born out of a desire for prefigurative forms of political belonging and connection. And that now maybe though, for a lot of people, it carries more baggage of the party form. And as we said right at the beginning when we first started talking, that our generation and those either side of it, our kind of political logic growing up was generally outside of the party form, because that, that we'd already seen more of that formal decline. So when we're again thinking about what might it mean to try and think about forms of political belonging now and what might be powerful or could be powerful, friendship for us seems like a useful or a more kind of generative way in that can totally include and encompass comradeship, but that comradeship maybe alone which, Jodie Dean, a brilliant book, and she writes so well about comradeship, but she says, really clearly, this relies on the party form, and maybe now we're on the brink of a new party form on the left, who knows? And so that will be really fascinating to see what kind of categories of political belonging we might be thinking through in the next few years. But for us, we see friendship as, what's so generative about it is that it can cut across these formal, informal, different forms of connection, and we can interrogate it and think through it as that. We're not confined to it within a certain structural sort of format, I guess.
I mean, even if your project is to build a new party form, like style of comradeship, you need to think carefully about these questions, I would say. And like, if it's not, I don't personally, that's like not my particular interest. I don't think that, I think we also then very much need to think, okay, well, what kinds of actual formal, long-term, sustainable categories of political belonging that actually borrow and learn from the best bits of comradeship, in terms of like giving us a sense of commitment longer term, giving us a sense of turning up for people in solidarity without needing to know the details, like unconditional support in different ways, and kind of I think those can be built into whatever we build.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm always really interested in like stuff around language and etymology and linguistics, because like, as you say, there's so much baggage that comes with the word comrade, and, thinking about the potential new party on the horizon in Britain, I think right now they've put that call out to sort of do the poll. What should we call the party? And that's going to come with, whatever is landed on will have connotations that are, historical, and maybe they'll be positive or negative, and it'll be interesting to see how the party traverses that. Because, as you say, like even in your sort of the treatment you give to the history of like comradeship and the word comrade, you're talking about this sort of homoerotic queer quality that the word had, coming from Walt Whitman, and then some of the associations that it's had with the party form that might be very negative actually for a lot of people, thinking back to that, and I think you kind of ultimately sort of land on the line that we need comradeship without the comrade, which is, in response to Jodie Dean's sort of defense of the comrade. But I'm also really, really pleased to see that, that you kind of deal with ideas of comradeship and comradely love that are at the heart of the political writings of Alexandra Kollontai, right? Which I guess predates the more Stalinist era of, the Bolshevik period, right? So it is more exploratory and more transgressive in terms of like gender norms and all the rest of it. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about Kollontai and how some of those ideas of comradeship are resonating or finding expression today, because you're also talking about Rojava and a word which I'll probably get wrong, Hevalti. Is that like how you say it? I don't know. But this Kurdish idea of like friendship, this concept. So could you say a little bit more about some of these ideas of like, comradeship, which are quite sort of interesting because, again, if the comrade is a container that implies friendship, but not necessarily interpersonal friendship, and you don't necessarily have to know or like the people you're in comradeship with. So there's a lot of interesting ideas here. Could you unpack some of this for us?
To be clear, you don't have to like your friends either.
Which is part of what we say, that friendship isn't just about getting along and like each other. But I hope that we show that in the book, and I think that leads us quite nicely into thinking about the Kurdish concept of Hevalti a little bit, because that is part of Öcalan's writing about kind of Hevalti or Heval as the friend and meaning friendship is, some would argue, maybe more along the lines of comrade, in the sense that it's about everyone is a Heval within the struggle, so everyone is a friend, and friendship actually isn't about getting super close to one particular person or having this sense of kind of cliquiness, but is rather an idea of friendship as a commitment and orientation it's the opposite within the struggle.
That.
But what's interesting, I think, is that it's it explicitly also is a rejection of kind of fill out like a family society, and thinking about friendship as a new form of not just political belonging, but belonging in life. A new way in which you could build a society. So I think Hevalti is really fascinating because it draws on elements of comradeship and thinking through friendship to create something that is much more imbued with the language of love and care, I think, than later 20th century renderings of comrade might allow. But then, as you say, perhaps actually recalls some of those earlier forms of comrade much more readily, thinking about those like late Victorian forms, you know, pursued by the sort of Fellowship of the New Life and thinking about the sort of early socialists in Britain, but also by Kollontai and others. So thinking about the way in which their comrade is so much a conversation about comradeship is a conversation about love. Maurice Casey, as you say, shows this really well, thinking through love and friendship as a vital part of comradeship. And I think Hevalti, interestingly, does that, but by using the language of friendship above the language of comradeship, really. So again, you're right to point to this question of kind of etymologies and semantics, because that is important. But I guess what we try and show is that precisely because friendship has always had quite a flexible definition, that thinking about what friendship means in the practice of doing it, you know, as a political practice, is perhaps the most helpful thing to us, that can cut across all these different versions of comradeship and forms of political belonging. Not to say friendship is the best and is the only way to do it, but to say that if we look for friendship as a practice, what do we find, and what does it look like, and how does it manifest? And as we found, and as you say, that does cut across more formal forms of comradeship, also cuts across biological ties, also cuts across different types of relationships. So it's not to throw those things out or to suggest a kind of hierarchy of forms of belonging, but to look for friendship and for us to try and sort of identify the sort of the radical potential of friendship across a lot of those things historically and today, I guess.
It's really nice to link Kollontai to Hevalti, and I think like there's an amazing book actually called Worth Fighting For, Bringing the Rojava Revolution Home, and I think that in that book they talk a lot about Hevalti, and they talk a lot about it's two people who went out to Rojava and then are thinking about what does it mean to try and bring some of the kind of concepts and ways of organising and ideas and practices back to a kind of context of Britain. So if people are interested, I'd really recommend that. And I think that I guess that to me that connects a lot back to when I mentioned Yvonne before, and this idea of kind of deliberative friendship in the context of like, you know, a racist border regime. Me and Yvonne met through this place, the Unity Centre in Glasgow, which is a drop-in space for people in the asylum and immigration system, which sadly closed like 2 years ago, kind of after the pandemic. It was open for 20 years, completely like run by volunteers throughout. Incredible place. And that's where I first encountered actually people explicitly, not just like doing it in the way you described in that first biological story, you know, like kind of just turning up and being friends in a way that's political, but actually at Unity explicitly saying, we say friend here, we don't say service user or asylum seeker or refugee. And you know, with the kind of latest onslaught of like horrendous racism and anti-migrant or like kind of rhetoric that's everywhere at the moment, and we've been fully encouraged by the government, and as it has been, to be honest, like for decades. You know, I think it's particularly important to think what that looks like and what form that takes. And in that case, I'd say like Hevalti, like Kollontai, these kind of ideas of friendship as an orientation to each other come out of struggle. They attempt to bring us back into struggle. In Kollontai and Rojava, they come from a particular analysis and like appreciation of the importance of feminism at the heart of it all. You know, I think it's really and a kind of critique not just of cliques and how friendship can be kind of negative and corrosive, but also of the family. And I think that all those things are present in all of that, and it kind of requires those critiques to actually practice the kind of friendship that I then experienced through Unity Centre, where you really do you get to you become incredibly close. There's people I see that we're not like similar in any way, we not necessarily get along, there's not like a kind of nice sentiment or like a shared interest, but we went through some stuff together that means we will always be bonded in a very dense way. And we appreciate that about each other, and we know we'd have each other's backs if something came up, which it regularly did. And like I think building those kind of relationships is so important. Actually, we're all out of practice with doing it. And I think that's the tricky bit, is to start practicing that again. And I think a lot of people are doing it every day, and people are doing it at their hotels right now and turning up and like fighting the fascists, but also showing support in all kinds of innumerable ways to the people who are being like, you know, beaten down by the system. And that's where those bonds emerge, I think. And
I think we've said a little bit when we've been talking about this, as you say, Joel, that, you know, forms of kind of comradeship and solidarity are so important, and we see that so much, but also that there's more in the mold of kind of Kollontai and thinking about Hevalti. One thing we mentioned quite a bit is, not necessarily in the book, but obviously recently in talking through the book, is thinking a lot about the Palestinian solidarity struggle, and what they've been so good at is thinking about solidarity across borders, but doing that, practicing that, and trying to kind of create more of these sort of friendship-based kind of face-to-face letter writing projects that actually are trying to bring people together in real life in kind of ways with an orientation to friendship that isn't just a sort of, not that there's a kind of that isn't just sort of solidarity as a kind of, I'm going to show up and sign this petition. That's super important, but also as a way of like a very quite a lived and quite a sort of rich type of, I guess, what we might think of as a dense bond. And I think there we do see again how friendship is so important within and across these other categories of how we might show forms of international solidarity or forms of solidarity in various ways. And that there's something, as Joel said, about the kind of practicing that, like getting better at doing it. It's hard, like, being friends and having an orientation towards friendship across difference and across this sense of, obviously what can feel like quite a sort of brittle left movement, sometimes understandably so for a lot of the reasons that we've highlighted about the way in which our relationships are so conditioned and policed. But that practice of doing friendship and orienting ourselves towards friendship, I think we can see where it can feel really generative, and a lot of us have experienced that, and that's so beautiful. And like, how do we think about that on a slightly bigger scale, I guess, is one question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that for me makes me think of towards the end of the book where you're talking about like place and space a little bit, and the idea of like militant particularism, which I guess isn't coming from David Harvey, but which David Harvey sort of develops. We often think of like local and global as maybe, like in opposition to one another, or that the local needs to sort of expand out to the global. And you sort of problematize that a little bit, I guess, and by bringing friendship into this, and maybe what you're talking about there in terms of how solidarity can be practiced with, Palestinians from our locality.
Like the Palestine solidarity movement has been incredible about bringing groups of people out to Palestine, and like I think so many people who'll be listening to this or have been involved in like instrumental and like doing so much incredible work to try and oppose the genocide in Britain right now will have had formative experiences of meeting people who were visiting in a delegation from Palestine or going to Palestine. And that's like a practice that's been happening historically for a lot longer, and actually maybe has been kind of eroded in different movements, sadly. But, even when I'm doing the Bradford Project, there was a lot of that going on with Nicaragua and Guatemala and Mozambique, at different moments of revolutionary upsurge from Bradford. Lots of people were going out and coming and visiting. And I think that we talk about that a bit in the book. And that's one way that I guess that in terms of this kind of, it can get a bit academic, and there is an important academic discussion to be had about the local global binary. But in a kind of practical sense for me, it's just about looking around you in where you live and thinking, these binaries don't work when I walk down my street. This doesn't hold. And it's actually an imposed sense of like that we are this like, whatever kind of little island. And I think we were just talking before about the Keir Starmer Island of Strangers speech, which is like, I think has set the tone for this like particular moment of Farage like mass deportation stuff. And I think that kind of idea that with these little enclaves ethnically and socially and culturally is so drummed into everyone. But then if you actually just like look around you for yourself, it's complete bollocks, obviously. And like we're so constituted by movement and people and things that are not easily separatable into anything like a nation. And we have way more, as this is the classic but very important like left-wing point, we have way more interest in common with the people inside those hotels than we do with like the people running the government. And like I think it's so important to just look at that history helps us see that and helps us think like what kind of weird little municipal identity and national identity am I being told I have to submit to, and actually indirect opposition and kind of like in a way that erodes other potential kinds of really powerful bonds. And how can we just like push past that? And that's kind of there's long histories of internationalism, long histories of doing that. But I guess for us as well, we quote like people like Harry Josie Giles and like thinking about that in Scotland and thinking about the forced movement of different people and the different ways that like the world, the landscapes and the cities that we inhabit have been shaped by these forces that are huge.
Well, yeah, and on that exactly like Doreen Massey says and David Featherston draws on her a lot. I love Doreen Massey because she's like, obviously there's this important to think about the local and the global, but she's like, even before you get there, the local, as you say, is already totally global. Like, it's been totally conditioned by movement of people, ideas, and also it's like the local, as Joel says, is constituted by these forms of mobilities and connections, and if we can open ourselves up to that and start looking for it, you start seeing it everywhere, and that's like a really powerful, politically powerful, I think, realization. And I think part of that last chapter where we do talk about the sort of space and place and local, global, obviously there's a lot of academic debates about this, but I guess what we're trying to say is that this idea that this sort of friendship here and then solidarity is like the bigger, better global version. We're like, well, actually, I think solidarity really relies on actually experiences of friendship in your day to day to understand forms of like affinity, intimacy, all those things that make humans empathetic creatures, comes from very, very localized to ourselves forms of connection. And that, the idea that a few people asked us on the tour, should there be a sort of universal declaration of the right to friendship for everybody? What would it look like? Surely everyone should be able to have friendship in such an alienated world. Like, what would that look like? And I guess part of what we say in that chapter is that, and other kind of left-wing writers who say that we need a kind of global solution to a global problem of global capitalism. We're a bit like, yeah, but if you try and universalize a solution or universalize a version of solidarity, it loses part of its power, because what is powerful about friendship is that it's entirely relational. It's entirely kind of made through the doing of, through a kind of a willingness to kind of think through difference, talk through difference, work through difference, and that, as David Scott says, it does, friendship doesn't presume a convergence of views, but reciprocally shelters difference. And that kind of generosity that comes with friendship, we argue, is so relational. It's made in the doing, and so we can't just kind of scale it up and be like, yeah, cool, everyone, solidarity is sort of meted out everywhere evenly, and that's how we'll solve the manifold crises we face. Obviously that doesn't work, that hasn't worked, and they're actually thinking through friendship and this idea of the very local and hyper local, even in ourselves, the way we do friendship and think through friendship, we argue can have a really profound effect on how we might think differently about global solidarities, about global struggle. So yeah, I think that question of scale is important, and this question of friendship isn't universal, as we've said, it's not prescriptive, it's not universal, and that's part of its power, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm glad that the answers you've both given there have touched on this kind of the importance of movement. And I think that's what I was trying to get at when I started talking about like how the local is never this essentialized kind of thing. Even you talk about like the Luddites, and you talk about Captain Swing sort of riots, even these things that are sort of probably very much read as kind of embedded in the locality, and yet there was always this interconnection sort of across the country, and an imagined friendship, sort of a mythology that sort of sprung up, which gave them this sense of connection. The fact that people have always moved, that there's always been this cross-pollination within sort of localities, even in this kind of imagined past we have that might be quite parochial. And obviously you devote like this really excellent sort of chapter to the importance of like movement, and you kind of look at the kind of the 19th century sort of lecture tour sort of circuit for socialists and anarchists, and how a lot of the real sort of substance of the kind of the thinking of these political movements came from the fact of movement, the fact that they were these sort of itinerants going from town to town, having these, political meetings, lectures, etc. But actually a lot of the stuff that was really important was the fleeting sort of ephemeral contact backstage or at the pub later after the, thing, or around the kitchen table. That was the most sort of exciting and revitalizing stuff for these people on tour. And then, those friendships might have only been for one day, or they might have had a really important impression. They might have also then had a repeat visit to that town because they'd had a warm reception. So there's a load of stuff there that's really fascinating that maybe we won't have so much time to sort of get into. But you've both been on a book tour yourself.
I was going to say,
what's your experience been of that? Have you managed to find any of those connections, or yeah?
Totally. Like we did the whole tour basically staying with friends or friends of friends. We talked about this a lot, that it felt kind of meta, like in the way that we talk about in that chapter, which obviously we connect these 19th century itinerant movements to, 21st century kind of zine and DIY music cultures. And again, we did the book tour in some DIY music venues, in the 1 in 12 club in Bradford, and also in Todmorden and elsewhere. And so we really found, anyone who, that's so, I think, familiar to a lot of us in the doing, but when it comes to then us thinking and writing about things, again, like we said right at the beginning, some of that gets lost. But I think a lot of us can recognize those feelings of like forms of hospitality when you're kind of on the road, that sense of like something being residential that takes you out of your everyday a little bit, enough for you to like feel that those kind of warm and also sometimes difficult feelings of like, oh God, I'm relying on this person, and I'm a bit exhausted, and it's difficult, and I feel like I have to be quite sociable or whatever. But those difficulties also come with that feeling of like this is what props it all up. Like it's only possible through those sorts of channels. And I thought that was really, I guess I didn't expect to feel it. Maybe we should have expected to feel it so much on tour, but we talked about that a lot, didn't we? Like that really was very present for us, that sense of.
And it's nerve-wracking, right? Because I think also a lot. I guess some people do this, like do your podcast, are very adept and used to lots of public speaking all the time, but like I'm not, and I was nervous about it because I think in a lot of ways there's a lot of chat about the kind of moving beyond the council culture moment and moving beyond these kind of. Gargie's interview, there's some really nice chat there about this. The letter actually, again, the letter form is nice because it gets away from the particular modes of interaction in the left where it's like a very quick response to a tweet, and it's kind of hot take, condemnation, virality, beef, whatever, and we can all get very addicted to that. It's very hard to avoid, and we all love to gossip about the beefs, right? But then I do think that there's that like remembering and trying to train ourselves to do kinds of discussion beyond that. And it sounds like an obvious point, but I do think a lot of us have like got quite bad at it, and particularly with the pandemic, like in terms of like having a discussion with someone, not just that kind of like let's have a debate, but like like actually being in a room where you feel like you've got some shared kind of interest, you've got some shared something at stake that you want to organise with, and like how do we actually bring people into that and talk and discuss things, and that doing that every night was really nice, and it was really different everywhere we went.
Yeah, and loads of people asked us loads of different types of questions, and some difficult questions, some people who didn't agree with certain things, but it was so amazing, as you say, Joel, to be reminded of how nice it is to talk through things that are really important to us, our political lives, our emotional lives, our very kind of sense of self. These are really important things, and it's quite a vulnerable topic for lots of people, but people really shared, and it was like, not to sound too sort of like starry-eyed about it, but it was really beautiful because you remember how nice it is. Like, it doesn't mean there wasn't any conflict. Like, we got into some quite heated debates in certain moments about like somebody would have a different take on something, but there was something about the kind of that real life, you're in a room together, nobody is waiting to kind of jump on you. It was very much a kind of these things mean a lot to a lot of people, and let's talking about them, and then having those kind of interactions, as we said, the sort of backstage stuff, and going to the pub after, staying with friends and friends of friends, just having those conversations play out in different spaces. Again, back to this question of like too many radical histories focus just on the ideas, but like, as we know, ideas don't move around on their own. They move through people, and where you are and the space you're in totally can dictate your willingness to be open to a new set of ideas, whether you feel a sense of hostility or warmth, whatever it may be. On the road, as we found, and as we talk about in that chapter historically, is where there often can be forms of generosity that it's easy to forget about or to feel a bit sort of bleak about when you're in an online space, that it's great to be reminded of in real life, some of those ways in which there is often more generosity than we might be led to believe, and it's easy. It's great to know that would be, in this current moment, something that you always hope. Again, maybe that sounds far too romantic, if people could just remember some of those forms of connection, but there is an element of that. Like, everybody, I think, would benefit. We all would benefit from thinking through what it might mean to do those kind of face-to-face, to actually engage with people in a particular way that has an intimate element to it.
Yeah. Well, we're nearly at the end, I think. I have, I guess, two last questions. One which sort of cuts against the grain a little bit of what we've been talking about, but and I don't know, maybe it's not interesting or useful, but like, we've been talking a lot about friendship. It's this, very sort of ordinary thing, even amongst people who are not radicals. It has this radical potential. It also clearly has this huge role to play in the building and sustaining and nourishing of radical movements. So we've also talked about the fact that this is a really alarming time. It's a time of genocide. It's a time of rising fascism. So everything that we've talked about with friendship, what it has meant and continues to mean for left movements. How much of this do you think holds true for far-right movements, which are on the rise, right? You know, if we're being glib, do fascists have friends? Is fascism sustained by friendship? Can friendship nurture fascism?
Yeah, we got this question actually in London, and it's a great question, or a version of it. And I guess my answer there succinctly is no, basically. And I feel like people might balk at that, but my reasoning would be that I think the kind of friendship we're talking about. Well, firstly, actually, let's look at how the far right and fascists talk about friendship. They are actually, obviously these people have social lives and they connect and they find some common interests, and they are very adept actually at recruiting and bringing people in and networking and stuff, right? But in terms of the kind of ones we're talking about, I think that's actually antithetical to their project, and I think they know that, and they have these kind of theories around. I mean, even just the kind of manosphere stuff, we talk about this idea you see a lot online. Yeah, my Insta feed was a mess. I'm trying not to go on it so much, but because I was looking into this stuff, and it's just you are the average of the 5 friends you surround yourself with.
So get 5 new ones, basically.
So get 5 new friends, level up your friendship. It's a real thing that a lot of these guys push on their kind of largely young male audience. And there's this kind of very instrumental, very kind of transactional idea of friendship. And I think that they also are very, very, very scared, particularly in the kind of, conservative right, around how friendship can interrupt the family. So there's a lot of stuff say, the obvious examples being you don't make friends with someone of a different gender, because that can a lot of these guys are very committed to that. You cannot be friends as a cis hetero man with a woman. You cannot be friends, right? So there's a very anti-social element to the far right, as we know. But I think on a fundamental level, then how does that help us would be my question. I'd hope that it can then help us diagnose what they are able to do in terms of recruitment, and how they're able to draw on a lot of these different platforms and ways of doing friendship or doing connection and ethics of it that I think are very convincing to people, at least in the short term. I don't think they provide anything that they kind of maybe on some deeper level want. And I think there's probably lots of analysis that could and maybe should be done around the way something like the incel world or the things that are adjacent to that actually involves a certain involuntary friendlessness too. There's a kind of lack of connection. It's not just about romance and sex. Yeah, we don't need to psychologize these people to see that they're motivated by some kind of very much a kind of loneliness and a lack of connection often. But that's not to that doesn't necessarily help us fight them. And I think doing this book right now, sometimes I've just felt oh my God, why are we talking about why are we wanting to write about friendship and try and feel hopeful and the possibility of that in the current moment? Why didn't we write a book about betrayal or about hatred or something? And I guess for me the answer would be because I do think that we need to come back to trying to find things that sustain this work. And that's why I originally got so interested about it in terms of Unity Centre. That work was very, very demanding, hard. Everybody burnt out. I certainly did. And yet from that time I have these connections that sustain me through it and sustain my attempts to continue to try and be involved in anti-fascist and no borders work, right?
I fully agree, and I think that there's a lot of in amongst kind of historians in the sort of field of history, I guess, histories of emotions. People are very interested in the histories of intimacy and emotion, and that's really valuable. And I think we can totally do a history of a lot of people in the far right. Of course, they have feelings and connections, and they have emotional lives, and that's interesting. But in a way, knowing that in and of itself, I guess, is what's different. Is what we're talking about here is a way of thinking about friendship as both, as we said, both an act that helps to sustain us through whatever we're doing. So we might say that people on the far right have forms of sociality that keep them going in some way or another, but that also what's politically potent or powerful about friendship in the guise in which we sort of present it in the book is to say that it's also prefigurative, that it's in the doing of it, you're hoping to create something of the world that you want to see. And so that the emotion of that is not just sort of incidental. It's that feelings are always involved in friendships. It's not incidental in that way. It's through those feelings and through that sense of friendship, we're hoping to create a world that is better at, forming types of connection, of creating a world in which people can feel better and that can craft a world that is prefigured on a form of interpersonal connection that creates that opens things up for people, that creates forms of sociality for more people, that creates a world that is not rife as right now with forms of fascism and aggressive forms of kind of totalizing capitalist despair, hellscape, etc. So for the far right, I would say, of course, this isn't a form of friendship in the way that we might recognize it, because the whole point there is, as Joel said, that there's not an interest there in creating a world in which we are better connected to one another. That's actually the antithesis of the project of a lot of these people on the far right. So while there might be forms of, sociality, there's feelings, whatever, friendship as a, dense bonds, that friendship as a way of life, friendship as a political project, I think cannot be a part of any kind of far right fascist project.
And it's like, like someone like Elon Musk is friendless, like on some level, but he's very powerful. And I don't think what we need is like an Elon Musk of the left. We need to think about how mutual obligation, like shared sense of like political belonging and ethics creating something very different, a movement, right?
Yeah.
And I just do think that like there's something there about, I think it'll be interesting, and maybe that's what we write next. Something about, the fact that these people are motivated by political belonging that is like very much contained by the nation, by eugenicist ideas of like race and so-called race, and that's where they turn to for their sense of like connection, not to any kind of like mutual sense of like, let's try and build something interrelational, interpersonal together.
Yeah, exactly. And therefore,
it's like difficult to that.
Those forms of friendship which are sustaining the far right now, or what we might talk about, obviously the sort of, as we said, the manosphere and this kind of tech bro vision of friendship that is totally embedded in the platforms which we are supposed to use for friendship, Instagram, Facebook, all the rest of it, etc., social media. The people who've created those platforms, as Joel says, I think maybe are friendless, or they've created a vision of friendship which is so instrumental, and they've created a version of friendship that has actually as we might not have thought right at the beginning, but we can totally see now, has achieved the inverse, which is to make us feel less connected because of this very instrumentalized vision of what friendship might look like. So the way in which the alt-right are connecting with one another through these forms which were supposedly forms of social media which were supposedly made to connect us really tells you a lot of what you need to know about how the limits of any kind of far right sort of sociality project can take us.
Maybe that's why they're so successful on those platforms, because they were created in the mold of these people who have this particular analysis of what a friend is. Like a Facebook friend is something you accumulate, something you monetize, something that is like basically a networking tool. Like I don't think Zuckerberg sees friendship in ways beyond that. I honestly don't. Like that's the kind of models they've created come from an ethic of friendship like that.
That's really interesting. Well, one last question then, I guess. A few months ago I was reading a book about whether or not we should colonize Mars, and it was written by two people who at the outset of writing that book had thought, yes, and let's now grapple with all the questions about how that might work. And by the end of writing that book, they realized that actually it's a terrible, terrible idea and we shouldn't do it. So I was just wondering, given that, as I say, sometimes people set out to write a book with a certain argument and then they end up writing something quite different or arguing something quite different. What are your thoughts on friendship now, and have they been altered at all by this process of research and writing? I
think we both started out, we both remained really hopeful, I think, and quite romantic about visions of friendship in certain ways. But I think we also... I learned loads for starters, so much from Joel, from all the people we talked to and read stuff about, like incredible amounts. But also, I think I did think more carefully about some of the limits, and we thought a lot about the way in which friendship, even in the forms that we think are great in lots of ways, the realization that actually some of those things have been co-opted and that we're able to access elements of that partly in ways that some people just can't. And what does that mean when we're trying to think about creating a more equitable world, etc. So I think a slightly more kind of clear-eyed view of friendship, I think, for me came through it. But I think actually no less hopeful, or kind of no less certain of actually the real need and power of friendships, and also no less sure that we can only think about political belonging by thinking through forms of intimate connections, a much more wider view of how we think about forms of interpersonal connection and political belonging that I haven't changed my way of thinking about that. I think that's so key. I think it is completely central, actually, to the remaking of the world. I still think that, but certainly a bit more clear-eyed, I think, about some of the ways in which I've been guilty of kind of making certain assumptions about sociality, or making being too sort of romantic about elements of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I've also learnt loads. I think particularly, like, I think we've written a history book, basically. I don't know if Pluto really expected that, but I think it's a history book, and some of it's very recent history. And I'm not a historian, but I've loved trying to, like, cosplay as one. And, like, I think that's really taken me some amazing directions. And, you know, in terms of thinking, what can we learn when we reach out a hand of friendship historically, geographically, you know, like thinking about it in all these different ways. That's been really amazing. And then, like Laura said, I think definitely we were writing, I'd say initially, slightly more just kind of like on the defensive. Look, people, stop just dismissing this fact of political life because it doesn't seem like as like righteous and organised as formal comradeship or something. We were maybe writing something a bit more in that mode initially, and then it's definitely, it grew into something a lot more critical of, and like thinking very, like, I mean, yeah, I guess spoiler if you've not read it, like it's actually not always that celebratory of friendship as a book. It's very much like thinking critically about the category too, and I think that's been like really important.
Totally, I think a lot of the book is very much about like the way in which friendship is police, the way it can be bad, the way it can undermine a lot of the things we're trying to build as well. But
like, we didn't talk about, like, we didn't mention the stuff around spy cops, which just briefly, you know, we have a whole chapter talking about how the state has policed friendship in a particular way, which I think reaffirms for us the fact that it is important, because in the same timescale, say post-70s that we're talking about, post-1970s, where there was a particular ascendance of like friendship affinity, this kind of diffuse set of ways of doing things politically, there was also like, you know, this like huge undercover policing operation across every element of like left-wing life, that if we really think carefully about how left politics would have looked if it hadn't been completely coercively surveilled and interrupted by the state. Obviously it's most explicit and horrendous in terms of the relationships that women were secretly kind of like coerced into with undercover police officers, but also the friendships. And this is something that a lot of these women in their writing come back to, the friendships that were also completely brutally kind of, you know, broken in terms of trust. And I think thinking about how that what a counter history of that 50 years would have been if we hadn't had the left wing movements that we know to have the kind of relationships of trust destroyed
totally
in that
eroded,
way. So I think I maybe came out of it with an appreciation of that as well, in terms of like, for all that the state doesn't validate or recognise friendship in many ways, it definitely understands its power as an organising principle, and has had to learn how to manipulate and abuse and kind of
and undermine,
destroy that. And that's been a historic fact for a long time, and something we need to think very carefully about as we enter this new era of like even more draconian and repressive prescription and policing.
Which I do think, again, like to come back to Joel's point, which is that, you know, in doing this kind of history, it is a kind of history of a history from within, I guess, but then also a history of the past, and hopefully maybe thinking through what a history of friendship might look like in the future, possibly. I think that's been really important, to see how the spy cops, you know, scandal isn't even a big enough word for it. You know, the more recent spy cop scandal, historicising that is horrendous, because you realise this is a forever thing that the state has sought to police and undermine, both spatially but also in these various intimate ways, undermine friendships. But also that in every instance where the people who are the most betrayed, most burnt out, still almost consistently still come back to friendship as their recourse for how to recover from such things, is such a beautiful reminder of how important it is. And also I think, you know, we talk about doing this project, this type of history itself as a type of kind of intergenerational friendship, because and finding those sort of friends in the past, and then thinking about how that might inform what we're doing today, and also thinking ahead to like forms of friendship in the future, to me feels like something valuable, because it's keeping a record of, and a kind of lineage of friendship that might often feels bleak and far away right now, but is always very present. And sometimes it's good to be reminded of that, and it's also, I think, good to sort of trace those lineages, because they're so often lost because of the way in which the state seeks for them to be lost or eroded, and because it's the hand of friendship, you know, across time. I always come back to, as you know, people keep coming back to friendship, you know, we can keep remaking from there. So there's something still hopeful in the book, I hope, and I think
And there's that, because there's always that Mike Davis quote that everyone comes back to, right? You fight with hope, fight without hope, fight anyway. But it's like, which I agree with, it's great. And I think we could talk about hope, we don't have time. But to fight, you need to not be alone. Fundamentally.
Yeah. You need friends.
And that's, so like, I think that's what's missing from that
Yeah.
little, very important kind of intervention on what hope is. Yeah.
That's a great place to leave it, I think. I mean, Laura, Joel, thanks so much. It's been as I say, I really loved the book, and it's been really great to talk to you about quite a lot of it, actually. I mean, there are some things that we haven't touched on so much. I mean, thanks for bringing in the stuff around and the policing and stuff at the end there. There's an intergenerational component, which we haven't really touched on so much, things about the living archive. So that's great. People can go and find a copy of the book and have a read. Once again, it's called Friends in Common, Radical Friendship and Everyday Solidarities. And it's out now from Pluto Press. So, Laura, Joel, thanks again so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Great to
cheers.
chat.
That was Laura Forster and Joel White on Radicals in Conversation. Once again, the new book, Friends in Common, Radical Friendship and Everyday Solidarities, is out now from Pluto Press. Podcast viewers can get 40% off the book through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. If you like the show, then please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, leave us a comment in the chat, or share the link with your friends as well. We'll be back in just a few weeks' time with our next episode of Radicals in Conversation. So until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.